Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Well, it's nice to hear this much energy in a room after 3 weeks of the start of the semester. So I'm Corinna Tritel. I'm chair of the Department of History, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce you to a celebration for Jonathan Judaken and his book, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, published just last summer by Columbia University Press. Let's give Professor Judaken a nice round of applause. So this event is co-sponsored by the Departments of History and Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies, abbreviated JIMES. And before I begin introducing our speakers, I wanted to thank, first of all, Flora Casson, who's immediately to my left, who did most of the heavy lifting organizing this. I also want to thank Chabad, Hillel, and the Program in Public Scholarship for supporting this event. And also say a thanks to those of you who helped get the word out to Jewish Light, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and the Holocaust Museum of St. Louis. So Professor Judaken's book, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, is both a work of history and a provocation. As history, it explores leading theories and theorists of anti-Semitism, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Hannah Arendt, and the members of the Frankfurt School. As provocation, the book invites all of us to think together about anti-Semitism's complex place in the world today. Professor Judaken's book, in other words, is a very good example of engaged scholarship. Our panelists today come from a wide variety of disciplinary and professional backgrounds. Together, they're going to offer a kaleidoscope of responses to the book, and we hope spark a lively conversation with all of us in the room tonight. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get to the really interesting part of tonight's event. So first of all, starting with Professor Judaken. He's the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought. He's jointly appointed in the Departments of History and JIMES, and he's also the chair of JIMES. He is a very productive scholar, conducting path-breaking works in his field of research, which include European intellectual history, Jewish studies, and cultural theory. It would be hard to summarize his importance, but I'm going to give this a shot. He's really good at revealing the workings of anti-Semitism in the years after 1945 in places you might not think to look. French existentialism, for instance. And he's also very well known for his dedication to stimulating exchange between scholars of anti-Semitism on the one hand and scholars of other forms of racism on the other. He's also a public intellectual. He's done things like conduct radio interviews for NPR, and he's written for a wide variety of outlets like Haaretz, Inside Higher Ed, and Tikkun. And I'll be a little bit briefer with my other panelists, even though they're just as impressive. So Flora Casson, immediately to my left here, is an associate professor jointly appointed in the Departments of History and JIMES. She made her name as a scholar of early modern Jewish life in Italy and Imperial Spain. More recently, she's branched out to consider the history of anti-Semitism in other times and places, and has a book coming out soon, and hopefully we'll be having a celebration for you pretty soon. Like Professor Judaken, she has dedicated significant energy to public scholarship, and she too has placed pieces in places like Slate, Haaretz, and other venues like that. Moving to the left, Adrian Davis is the William M. Van Cleve Professor in the School of Law and also a professor of organizational behavior at the Olin Business School. She's pretty hard to pin down in a few words. Yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Oh no, you're not getting off that easy. So many of us remember her as the former vice provost for faculty and institutional diversity. Others know her as an inspired teacher and scholar whose engagement with everything from feminism and critical race theory to slavery law and everyday life has led to a variety of publications in everything from law reviews to collected volumes. All the way to the left is Mark Oppenheimer, who is a professor of practice at the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. He's also the executive editor of the center's journal, Religion and Politics. He has a PhD in religious studies. He's taught all over the United States and somehow managed to find the time to write 5 books, with the 6th one on the way, on children's author Judy Blume. Yeah. Professor Oppenheimer is also a public scholar with articles in a variety of venues and a very popular podcast called Unorthodox about Jewish life and culture today. Even if you don't know it, you've probably read something by him or heard him on the radio. Okay, you're in for a treat.
Hello, can everybody hear me? I'm speaking in the microphone, okay. So, since Professor Judaken is a fan of Jean-Paul Sartre, I decided to start my remarks with Sartre's one-time friend who later became his rival, Albert Camus. In 1946, Camus wrote « Mal nommer les choses, c'est ajouter au malheur de ce monde », to name things poorly, meaning not to be precise and careful about the words we use is to add to the sadness and the misery of our world. Professor Judaken's book deals with a difficult and painful subject, anti-Semitism, and we will discuss many aspects of his book tonight. On some aspects we will agree, and on others we will disagree. That's academic debate. But what is immediately apparent to anyone who has read or will read the book, and I hope everyone here will, is how attentive Professor Judaken is about the words he uses, how careful he is about making sure he and his readers understand clearly what each concept and word means. Professor Judaken's detailed attention to the meaning of words and concepts is one of the features and strengths of the book. He's doing it page after page and demands from his readers that we do the same. And so whatever our opinion about the book may be, I think there's one thing that for sure no one can say, and that is that this book adds to the misery of the world. If anything, it's the opposite. Professor Judaken's careful analysis probably helps the world bear this heavy and difficult subject a little bit easier. The book has a lot more, but words is how we understand the world. So I want to focus on a couple of illuminating examples of Judaken's methodology. To start, Judaken's particularly attuned to the paradox that the more we use a word, the less we know what it means. He makes this case early in the book when discussing the question of how anti-Semitism should be spelled. So should it be spelled anti-Semitism or in one word, anti-Semitism? For many years, scholars who worked on anti-Semitism discussed whether to hyphenate or not, and that's what we spend our time with. And eventually a consensus emerged that the hyphen should go away. These scholars argued that the idea that there was a Semitic race to which all Jews belonged was, like all racial pseudoscience, a 19th century invention. And so to hyphenate as if Semitism was a noun referring to a real-world phenomenon was akin to lending credibility to 19th century racial theories. And most scholars agree with that, but Professor Judaken cautions us about becoming too comfortable with this consensus. He argues in his book that if we unthinkingly adopt the unhyphenated version, we risk forgetting that not only Jews, but also Arabs were subsumed under the false category of Semites. And if we forget that, it is harder to understand why and how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are entangled and related to one another. And if we forget that and we don't understand this entanglement anymore, it becomes that much easier for the 24 hours news cycle and social media to draw our attention to differences and disagreements at the exclusions of the similarities and parallels between the two. So this is just one example of how, in thinking about something that may appear to be a minor spelling question, Professor Judaken can derive important caveats and conclusions. His bigger question, however, is not about the hyphen, but about the term anti-Semitism itself. In fact, he advocates for us to stop using the word anti-Semitism and use Judeophobia instead. As anyone who's following the debates about anti-Semitism knows, there are sharp disagreements on what the definition of anti-Semitism is. Different groups of scholars have proposed their own definition, and no definition has been accepted unanimously. Given the political relevance of this question today, what might otherwise have remained a dry academic debate has become a high-stakes issue. As Professor Judaken notes in his book, I quote, "For scholars of anti-Semitism, the political struggle over these contemporary definitions hinders rather than helps how they approach their subject. Perhaps, therefore, it is time to adopt a different vocabulary that will nuance our understanding and thereby sharpen the tools in the struggle." Similar to his point about the hyphen, he argues that Judeophobia defamiliarizes the reader, and that allows for the conceptual reflection that he's asking us to engage in. He then points out that anti-Semitism should not be discarded, but it should be more precisely circumscribed. It should be reserved for the period between the end of the 19th century, when it became a racial hatred, and end with the Holocaust, when it climaxed. So in my remaining time, I want to discuss why circumscribing anti-Semitism and introducing a new term makes sense from a historical perspective. And I'm drawing here from his 5th chapter on the French historian Léon Poliakov. Poliakov, a French historian who survived the Holocaust, wrote one of the earliest and still excellent books on anti-Semitism. It's a 3-volume excellent book. His book preceded Raoul Hilberg's, who wrote the first book on the Holocaust, but Poliakov was not focused on the Holocaust. His focus was on tracing the history of anti-Semitism and understanding what led to the Holocaust. Of course, historians are supposed to start from the past and not from the present, but if we are honest, many of us become interested in a topic because we want to understand the problem in the present. And Poliakov was a good enough historian that he was able to overcome this and still write a first-rate history book. But even before Poliakov, another French historian, Jules Isaac, published a book called Jesus and Israel in 1947. He had started writing it during the war in reaction to the silence of the church about the Nazi persecution of Jews. Isaac survived in hiding, but the rest of his family was deported and murdered. And he argued that the roots of anti-Semitism could be found in the Gospels and in centuries of Christian teachings about Jews. Centuries of what he called the teaching of contempt were bound to have an effect. If people are told over and over again that Jews killed Jesus, that they are greedy and cruel, and that they kill Christian children, these stereotypes, as Judaken highlights, can find their way in conversations and different types of discourse, impacting how Jews are seen and read in society with harmful effects. Poliakov, who published his 3-volume history of anti-Semitism 3 years after Isaac, agreed with his point about the church. But the chronological scope of his book was much longer. It extended into the modern world, and in those later chapters, he argued that Nazi hatred of Jews was very different from the Christian hatred that preceded it. Isaac was correct that the Christian hatred is what predisposed the silence of priests and clerics and French Catholics, but anti-Semitism was different from Christian anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism was racial hatred of Jews. In anti-Semitism, the Jews' otherness was no longer a matter of faith or religious conflict between Judaism and Christianity. The reason Jews were different and hated was in their bodies and in their blood. And whereas before the modern era, Jews could convert and change their faith and become Christians, once anti-Semitic hatred took over, nothing could change who the Jews were. So like Judaken, this previous generation of scholars rejected eternal anti-Semitism, meaning they accepted that something akin to Jew hatred existed for many centuries, but not that it was always the same and that history is just an eternal repetition of the same thing. And so just like Christian anti-Judaism was not the same as modern anti-Semitism, what we are seeing today is different from the past too. Anti-Semitism today, or rather Judeophobia, is, as Judaken tells us, neither primarily religious nor primarily a racial hatred. He defines Judeophobia, I quote, as encompassing the denigration of Judaism, defamation of the Jewish character, discrimination against Jews, their racialization, and at its extreme efforts at destruction of the Jewish people, end of quote. But even though Judeophobia encompasses elements of anti-Semitism, the racialization and murder of Jews, it is different because today's post-Holocaust Judeophobia, I quote again, is about a cultural and political conflict and not about an ostensible racial conflict. And it is unprecedentedly global. Professor Judaken is correct that a new term is needed, but his definition is also conceptually different. Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism focused on what was hated within the Jews, their religion or their race. Judeophobia, as defined by Professor Judaken, encompasses stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, racialization, and murder, and applies in one way or another to all periods of Jewish history. So we move from a definition that's centered on Jews to one that is descriptive and focuses on the feelings of fear of the hater. In this, Professor Judaken aligns with Sartre, whose understanding of anti-Semitism and all racisms actually focused on fear too. In his essay on the Jewish question, Sartre wrote, I quote, "The anti-Semite is a man who fears, not Jews, but himself, his conscience, his freedom, his instincts, his responsibilities, his loneliness, society, and the world. The Jew is only a pretext. Elsewhere, he will hate black people, and elsewhere, he will hate Asians," end of quote. This is a powerful insight into the minds of the haters, but it makes it harder to understand what is unique and specific about each group of victims, since the hater will just move their fear from one group to the next. In arguing for a new term, Professor Judaken reminds us that even though Jews are the victims of Judeophobia, it really is the problem of the Judeophobe and not of the Jews, because if it wasn't Jews, it would be another group. And victimized groups aren't responsible, it is the haters. And in our case, the Judeophobes who should be working on their misplaced fears. Finally, this also reminds us of the deep entanglements of all these different hatreds that Professor Judaken argues is essential to understanding each and every one of them. But like Judaken's argument on losing the hyphen, I wonder if something is not lost here too. Something maybe about the specificity of Jew hatred and what distinguishes it from the other hatreds it is entangled with. Professor Judaken has opened a very important question here by introducing a new term and demanding that we consider seriously all the entanglements and similarities. I hope that he and his students and future researchers will take on the challenge of clarifying and explaining the tension between entanglement and specificity. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I just joined the faculty in May, so this is like feels like a coming out, and I'm excited to. What a great chance to meet so many of you. Tonight, I'll say especially Professor Judaken, whose book is a really remarkable accomplishment and taught me so much. I don't break out this blazer for just any scholar, and it's not just that his book was so good, but that it's one of the first academic books I've ever seen without a subtitle. That academics all title their books, Umrath Hall, the history and practice of sociology in St. Louis from, where, and there's no colon. And surely you talked about that with your editor, right? I mean, this was like, but they just, They just completely nailed it. Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism. Boom, no subtitle. It's a really good book, and I learned a lot. I have two, but it won't be fruitful for me to stand here and tell you how great it is. So I'm going to tell you about my two minor quarrels I had with the book. And interestingly, I think they're not so much criticisms of the book's author as of his subjects and perhaps his treatment of the subjects. That is to say, I come out of the book really liking Jonathan, whom I met for the first time tonight, but liking many of his subjects less than I would have thought possible. Even though these are the people who are theorizing anti-Semitism, an incredibly important topic. I want to begin by just posing the question, I wonder, and this came to me just a few minutes ago that this might be a way to put it, whether it's possible to successfully theorize Jew hatred or Judeophobia if you have no theory of Jews. That is to say, like, I wonder I think that when we think about other hatreds or isms, maybe I'm wrong about this. This came to me just as a way of crystallizing this in the past few minutes. But I think when we theorize what it is that people hate in other kinds of bigotries and prejudices in other minority groups, racial, sexual, gender, national, etc., we often imagine that the bigots have a theory of the people they hate. And what's so interesting is how many of Professor Judaken's subjects seem to have thin to no theory of the people whom they despise, or even the people whom they're trying to theorize hatred of, right? That is to say, we know a lot about Sartre's theories of anti-Semitism, but what were his theories of Jewish humans? There's a recurring trope I noticed, which is that sometimes Jonathan would talk up a great theorist of anti-Semitism only to sort of take it back a little bit and say, however, here is one way in which this person's thought fell short. And very often their thought fell short in how they looked at actual Jews. And I think that sometimes Professor Judaken treats these as minor bugs that could be ironed out while preserving the vitality of the thought, when maybe they might be intrinsic features of the software. I'll give you an example. I'll start with a theorist whom a lot of us might know because they're contemporary, Judith Butler. Judith Butler is somebody who, and this is from Judaken's book, has famously called Hamas and Hezbollah progressive social movements, famously denied that the recent October 7th attacks were anti-Semitic, and so forth and so on. Now, Professor Judaken notes, and this is very important, that Judith Butler has consistently rejected violence over the course of their career. And I would say that Professor Judaken then goes on to kind of moves this aside a little bit and celebrates Butler as one of the honest anti-Zionists, a kind of connected critic, to use what I think was Michael Walzer's term. But I would argue that if one takes some of those views on Hamas and the situation and the murder of Jews to be as problematic as I take them to be, one would also have to wonder if the person holding those views could possibly be a good guide to many other issues, including, for example, anti-Semitism. In the treatment of the Marxist, Leninist, and Stalinist traditions of theorizing anti-Semitism, Professor Judaken seems to credit that Marxist tradition through, say, the 1950s with a kind of authentic universalism of wanting all ethnicities and nationalisms to waste away, not just Zionism, not just Russianism, but everything sort of for a grand communist revolution and a utopian future. And then the idea seems to be that these ideas got twisted, perhaps by Stalin's heirs, in an anti-Semitic direction. But it might be the case that the radical universalism in the Leninist-Stalinist tradition could always end up conducing toward violence against practicing Jews anyway, or ethnically particular Jews. Certainly that seems to be the evidence of history. If we look at European history, if we look at where robust kind of top-down socialism has been tried in our hemisphere and so forth and so on, it might cause us to wonder whether we have to re-examine the Stalinist universalism and the Stalinist theorizing of Jews. Aurea Botelja, the former spokeswoman of the French Indigène movement, is referred to in this book as, in some cases, and I want to be fair here, some of her work is, quote, brilliant. But then Professor Judaken goes on to note that she has cozied up to and suborned numerous anti-Semites over the years, not just Dieudonné, but other noted anti-Semites in the French context. And so we're left with this question of, is it the case that somebody who has really loathsome ideas in certain contexts can be brilliant in other contexts? I'm actually of the point of view that yes, one can. People are complicated. I think all of us probably hold some bad ideas, and hopefully alongside them we hold some really smart and thoughtful ideas. But I think it's worth interrogating more what to make of someone's supposed brilliance, or of the Stalinist insight, or the Butlerian insight, when put up against some places in which there's a real kind of clouded vision, to be generous. When the book speaks of the Neo-Pauline theorists of anti-Semitism, people like Alain Badiou, it's noted that someone like Badiou comes by his sympathy for the Jews only by preferring the sort of the right kind of Jew, right? And this is a kind of, the Neo-Pauline school, and this goes down to Slavoj Zizek today, but a sort of European tradition of saying the Jews can be fine, but sometimes they're saying they can be fine as long as it's the right kind of Jew, the universalist Jew, the liberal Jew, the enlightened Jew, not the sort of materialistic Jew, or the particularist Jew, or the ethnically clannish Jew, or the religiously observant Jew. And again, I sort of had to wonder, well, the kind of person whose theorization of anti-Semitism depends so much on views that reduce actual Judaism as practiced to a kind of sideshow or a footnote might be problematic in ways that bear more inspection. Now, I should say that Professor Judaken raises someone like Badiou only to point out this was someone who was really, really problematic. He is very conscious of these shortcomings. But I guess I just want to say that, you know, while the point in the book seems to me that there is something to be rescued from this tradition, or something worthy about it, I really think that those who treat only the so-called enlightened or universalist Jews as the authentic and likable ones are kind of enemies of the Jews, right? I mean, if you posit that the only good Jews are the ones who have left their Judaism at the door, you're saying there's not much that's good in Judaism. And by the way, this is an insight that we should have about all marginal and minority groups, right? That if you're asking people to check their queerness or their African Americanism or their indigeneity or whatever at the door for a kind of universalist project, if that's the condition you pose for admission, that's, you know, what kind of condition is that? So it's not that these writers don't have something important to teach us. They surely do, and I personally profited a lot from this book. It's only that the quality of some of these theorists of anti-Semitism, here I would also include the American Protestant Talcott Parsons, who had his own supersessionist liberal Christian biases, in some ways the quality of their thought struck me as very, very low. Their understanding of lived Judaism, especially by observant Jews or Jews who are not cosmopolitan and universalist, it seems stilted and stifled and poor. One feels that they didn't try very hard, which, by the way, is something I've always kind of thought about Hannah Arendt, who, of course, herself is Jewish, right? That there's a kind of refusal to see, or fully see, in their fullness, a certain kind of, in her case, fellow Jew. Second of two quarrels that I'll put out there. And here I want to zoom in on Arendt a bit. One of those who did try reasonably hard to see the world as it is, and again, with some failings, was Hannah Arendt. And one of her great points, which Professor Judaken really explains as beautifully in a dozen pages or so as I think I've ever seen it explained before. Arendt is very difficult, for me anyway. I find her a very, very tough reader to move through and understand. But one of the Arendtian arguments that he elucidates is her view that anti-Semitism can't be seen as eternal. And it is true. I mean, this is very, very important, right? That there's a certain school of you know, philo-Semitism or Zionism or kind of activism that says Jew hatred is always and forever here. It comes from before time, it goes till after time, and it's eternal. And she was one of the kind of early impression critics saying, well, that can't make much sense. And here I would agree with her and with Professor Judaken's praise of her, what I take to be praise of her, and agree that maybe anti-Semitism is not eternal. Of course it's not. It's not inscribed into the logic of the universe, right? One can imagine a world in which it does not exist. But here I would say that if not eternal, anti-Semitism is fairly ubiquitous. That is to say, one can imagine a world logically without it, right? If certain groups of people went up and settled on Mars and, you know, brought a certain set of ideas with them, one could imagine that human society evolving without anti-Semitism. It's not logically necessary in the way that perhaps language is almost logically necessary to our humanness, right? But it is ubiquitous. Professor Judaken's book is fairly limited to Europe and at times the North African context, which is perfectly defensible. It's looking at a particular important lineage of theory. But of course, anti-Semitism is not limited to Europe or North Africa or even former European colonies. It's widespread not only throughout the Arab world, the Persian world, Turkey, and so forth, but also places that historically have had close to zero Jews, like Taiwan, for example, or Indonesia, which may have over 1,000 Jews now after having fallen into the single digits, we think, some in the past few decades. And these stereotypes of Jews have their own non-European lineages. There's, of course, the famous, this has been written about, the famous hotel chain in Taiwan, the Talmud Business Hotels. Has anyone here heard of the Talmud Hotels? Right? It's a chain in Taiwan that purports to be inspired by the business lessons that can be gleaned from the ancient rabbinic texts of the Talmud. Here I'm quoting from an article about it. Although the 63-volume, 6,200-page Babylonian Talmud itself touches only occasionally on business practices, the proprietors of the hotel believe that these teachings contain insights for how to achieve financial success in the modern age. Each guest room reportedly comes with a copy of a book called the Talmud Business Success Bible on the nightstand. Now, of course, this is not Judeo-phobic or anti-Semitic, but it's definitely trading on stereotypes of the Jews that may or may not have European lineages. That is to say, we don't fully know, and I don't think any of the thinkers whom Professor Judaken inspects fully explains why so much Judeophobia, Judeopathy, anti-Semitism, whatever you want to call it, exists in so many corners of the globe. And even if one could find certain European lineages, surely in these different geographical contexts, they really would ultimately end up begging for new explanations and new lineages. So that is to say that unlike other kinds of bigotries, including ones that right now in America are no less worrisome and no less worthy of our attention, the anti-Semitic lineages have their own histories and byways that may in fact be separate. And the effort to sort of yoke them together as both with anti-Semitism, with Islamophobia, but also with other antipathies, while noble and while I think certainly important to a cultural analysis and to a politics, is not entirely persuasive to me. Yoking ubiquitous anti-Semitism worldwide under theories derived from Marxism and Freudianism and the other several lineages discussed in this book, which so often depend on a history of Jews as an urban merchant class in an urbanizing and class-stratified Europe, frankly, doesn't entirely go as far as I would like in explaining to me much about the global context of anti-Semitism, which, while I pray not eternal, I suspect may continue to be ubiquitous. Thank you.
I want to belatedly welcome my colleague, my new colleague, Jonathan, and commend his new book, which I am putting on reserve as optional reading for my critical race theory class. So thank you so much. And much of what's driving both my enthusiastic welcome and my commendation is his enhancement of the WashU ranks of scholars drawing on myriad critical theories and schools of thought to understand one of the most pressing issues of our time, the ongoing hatred of, or as he might say, phobia towards groups and collectives, hatreds and phobias that undermine the twin projects of both democracy and egalitarianism. I also want to thank Flora Casson for inviting me to join the discussion of this important book, which provokes us to theorize one of the most damaging and yet, as I was persuaded, under-theorized hatreds of our time, anti-Semitism. And with his rigorous engagement with critical theorists of anti-Semitism, Sartre, Lyotard, Arendt, and others, Judaken accomplishes many things, some of which you've heard about from my colleagues Mark and Flora, and I'll call out a few that were of a special interest to me as a legal scholar, critical race theorist, and black feminist theorist. First, the book offers an incisive set of tools to cut through the tangle of what Judaken calls a Holocaust memory complex, to encounter anti-Semitism or Judeophobia not as something that is universalized, ahistorical, inevitable, and eternalizing, but rather something that can be periodized into discrete modes of time. And I take it that Mark, you and I may disagree a little bit on the success of his argument there. I was more persuaded perhaps than you were. So in his pre-World War II or pre-Holocaust modes, which he characterizes as a rabbinic set of theories, a Christian set of theories of anti-Semitism, liberal, and then Zionist ones, he gives us a through line in these many theories, but he shows us the through line is that they all are theorizing Jewish folks as the objects of hatred and persecution, and therefore how Jewish folks themselves might change. And I thought you very neatly and persuasively fit Zionism into that with its theory of how Jews could change by embracing nationalist understandings of their identity and rejecting diasporic ones. I thought that was a really, really nice move that you made. And perhaps after you have your response, we can talk a little bit more about why I was so persuaded. I took the point to be that anti-Semitism is in fact ubiquitous, but that it doesn't serve us very well just to say it's ubiquitous. What we really want to understand is the different modes and the different iterations in which it occurs over time. And that part of, I think, what has happened is that because we have in mind one set of iterations, we sometimes miss then anti-Semitism. To go back to one of my favorite books, Beloved, they say there's a moment in which they say we were looking the wrong way and we didn't see the evil coming because we were looking the wrong way. So having, I think, a good taxonomy and a good understanding of the shape-shifting, as you say, that Judeophobia can take over time helps us then invite sort of the specific context of varying political economies to understand and perhaps identify it and identify some of its precursors. Second thing that really struck me about the book is his call to shift from anti-Semitism to Judeophobia, something I actually first saw someone say on my Facebook page, but I didn't take it seriously until I read your book, you see, and that's the difference between social media and a deeply rigorous academic book. So the Judeophobia I took to be, this shift I take to be prompted by several things. One is it's borrowing on the critical theory insight that sometimes defamiliarizing concepts, as you said, Flora, that sometimes takes new language, new vocabularies, new grammars to defamiliarize concepts so that we can then really prompt rigorous reflection on them. So I certainly welcome it in that sense. I also thought that one of the things you were calling for was very important, that if it is the case that much of earlier iterations of the studies of anti-Semitism focused on the Jewish folks themselves, that in Judeophobia, we really would have a relentless focus on the people who are perpetuating the hate, or the objects and institutions and the structures that are perpetuating the hate. And so I really appreciate that as well. It might be then that we need studies of both anti-Semitism and Judeophobia, but I was persuaded by that as well. And then the final insight that I appreciated about part of your shift is, excuse me, he shows us how this understanding of something as being Judeophobia is necessarily entangled with theorizing other forms of the other, including especially racism and anti- or decolonial theories. For instance, he contends that one reason to make the shift to Judeophobia is the linguistic and conceptual linkages to Frantz Fanon's concept of phobogenic objects, that is, objects we encounter in the conventional phobias, Islamophobia, homophobia, xenophobia, gynophobia, which, and here I'm quoting, name subjects not just of hatred, but of anxiety or unsubstantiated fear or resentment, but also of fascination or envy, close Jonathan quote, right? So from there, he ends up borrowing from the theorist Sandauer to sketch Allosemitism, which captures importantly both anti-Semitism, but also philo or philo-Semitism as well. So I'd like to focus quickly on two particular insights that struck me, and then end by posing a few questions or musings. The first insight is one that I think also struck you, Flora, as well, which was the hyphen. So I come from, the hyphen has been certainly part of debates over African American identity for a very, very long time, but in the opposite or the reverse way, which is the capturing of identity. Should it be Black American, African American, Afro-American? Should there be a hyphen? Should there not be a hyphen? I personally thought there should be a hyphen, but then people would become so upset. I thought my stake just in the ground isn't that deep. But now you have prompted me to go back and fight for my hyphens or the removals where I want them. But I was especially provoked. I won't repeat what Flora said, but I'll just gesture toward it. I had never really thought, I never had thought of the politics of the hyphen in anti-Semitic. And when the book initially said that the problem with the hyphen is that it's then reifying or casting Semitic as a standalone concept, right, that has some kind of real meaning rather than some kind of construct that we should be skeptical of, I thought, right, no hyphen. I'm against the hyphen. And then I turn the page, and then he says exactly as Flora captures, which is that, but if Semitic comes out of a much more modern understanding or a modern casting of Muslims or Islam and Jewish folks as sort of the external and the internal threat or enmity to Western liberal democracy or to Western liberal democracy, then Semitic in that sort of marriage is something that perhaps we should be embracing, and so perhaps we should have the hyphen. So I thought, okay, I don't know what to do with the hyphen now, so I'm going to go with Judeophobia, which I'm thoroughly persuaded by. The second point I want to make is kind of just a quick, I'm going to pivot just as a true critical race theorist, and just pivot for just a moment to the personal and say, I really want to thank you for this concept of the philo-Semitic, because it gave me a little bit of distance between myself as the grown Adrienne and myself as a little girl, and understanding myself perhaps as someone who was deeply a deep philo-Semite because of the place in which I grew up, living next door to Mrs. Bloom's latkes, and constantly running up to the Parkway Deli for my rugalash, and in my adult years, feeling that nothing could cure my colds except for like matzo balls that were like the size of my fist. But also more seriously, being a young African-American girl in the 1970s, sort of coming to theorize my own place in the world through reading a lot of the novelizations of Anne Frank, I Am Rosemarie, these other kinds of books about young teenage girls in concentration camps, and now having a more critical framework to understand perhaps that person who she was. So I want to thank you for that. So I want to move on then just to the set of musings or questions that the book provoked for me. So one is, you are unsparing in your calls to understand both Judeophobia and anti-Semitism as necessarily entangled with other forms of racism in the modern era. And you perform this entanglement in many ways as you put Sartre and others in conversation with many anti-colonial theorists or decolonial theorists, including Fanon and César, and then later you have Memi and Said and Homi Bhabha. Absent, though, were the myriad critical race theorists who have parsed important concepts, including the elusive nature of an intent, the social construction of race, which is a predicate of racism, et cetera. So it's kind of a musing or question is sort of how you're locating yourself within critical race theory. Is it sort of that critical race theory is drawing on it has a shared genealogy with your project, or do you mean to actually engage with a specific set of theorists? Because I don't necessarily understand the decolonialists as critical race theories. They are enacting critical theories of race, but not necessarily critical race theory per se, which I take to be a contemporary project that begins in like the 1970s or something. So anyway, so this leads to a second thought. Much of what we might think of as second generation critical race theory in law sought to theorize the production of overlapping and yet distinct non-white groups in the United States. Of particular relevance to Jonathan's book, and this is kind of maybe, I sort of found myself fantasizing like, I don't know, epilogues or codas or adjacencies to your book. So take this as, not criticism, but things that I would have loved to have me sort of, maybe Talmudic notes on the side or something, I don't know, something. A particular relevance, I thought, would be the understanding of Asian Americans as a model minority. That is the group that is simultaneously held up first as a model for emulation by other groups, who are cast then as irredeemably abject, but then also cast as being a fantasized object of envy and resentment, and finally reviled as the perpetual outsider and foreigner. And this strikes me as overlapping with your important deployment of allo-Semitism as capturing simultaneously fantasy, resentment. So critical race theory's next move with Asian Americans is a crucial one. So although cast as a model minority vis-a-vis other minorities, they're also cast as perpetual foreigners. So for these purposes, Black Americans compared to Asian Americans are then the true Americans, even if imperfectly so. So the CRT, or critical race theory insight, strikes me as important for what might be the set of adjacencies to your book. That's the question of how other non-white groups might be recruited into Judeophobia, right? Invited by the dominant white nation state to uphold various Judeophobic tropes. I'm gonna cut it through a couple, but I do want to end with just one final point. I found myself thinking a lot in some of your discussions of Zionism in Israel. I found myself thinking about shared Jewish and Black fantasies of nationalism. And I found myself, and I spent, when I was doing reparations work in the 1990s, I was, surrounded by a lot of Black nationalists. And so I found myself wondering if there might be some fruitful dialogue for us there to think about this fantasy for nationalism, and perhaps making it a project that's a bit more familiar to folks who are who purport to not understand at all this desire for a homeland and a nation. So I had a lot more to say, but I look forward to continuing in our conversation.
So I think now you're going to respond, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
So first of all, I just want to express my deep gratitude for all of you for coming this evening. We wouldn't be here tonight if it really wasn't for Flora. I was really, really grateful to her for picking up the mantle and really making a book celebration what I really wanted my book launch and book celebration to be here at Washington University, which was exactly what happened tonight. There were lots of reasons why my wife and I and my family uprooted and moved to WashU, but for me, the epitome of what that was all about was at a book celebration for one of our colleagues, Tabea Linhart, last year. It was one of a series of events that I went to every couple of weeks that had me nodding my head and feeling that deep sense of fulfillment inside that I was in the right place. Because here there was a book that had been written by a colleague, and then a series of other colleagues who got up and offered a set of really brilliant, deep, insightful reflections about the ways in which they had been moved to think and rethink some of what their work was about in light of that book. And that's what I got to experience, and I'm really grateful to you, to all of you. It was really important for me to have someone here tonight who works explicitly on critical race theory, so I was really grateful that Flora invited Adrian. And then I got sort of out of the blue an email, I think, from Mark indicating that he was going to be here, and I felt immediately like a little fanboy because I listened to Unorthodox, this podcast that Mark Oppenheimer started, which is the largest Jewish podcast in the world. And all of a sudden he was asking me a question and saying he was going to come to WashU, and immediately I was like, oh my God, would you be willing to respond to my book at this book panel that we were literally in the midst of trying to figure out? So this is really exciting for me. It's a book that I've been working on, as I talk about in the acknowledgments, since I was a postdoc at Hebrew University. That means, like, for it to come fully to fruition, it's like 25 years or something in the making. It's a lot. So I'm excited. I want to sort of just back up and give some of you sort of the big picture of what the book tries to do, and then zero in at least on some of the specific issues that have been raised by the three commentators, by Flora, Mark, and Adrian. So this is a book that isn't directly about anti-Semitism per se. It's not a history of anti-Semitism. It's a meta book. It's a book about how we ought to think about how we think about anti-Semitism, okay? And the way that the book proceeds is that it's framed first by an introduction that's kind of a gauntlet that I throw down to the field of anti-Semitism studies in order to offer a whole series of challenges about the ways in which much of the field, the majority of the field, is thinking about the problem of anti-Semitism and what the problems are that emerge with those kinds of approaches. And then the heart of the book is 7 chapters that deal with 7 major theorists who stand for a paradigm for offering an underlying or overarching explanation of anti-Semitism, or, as you heard numerous times tonight, what I prefer to call Judeophobia. And then the last chapter is about our contemporary moment, again, looking at a set of complicated and difficult issues about the ways in which, in the contemporary moment, the kind of post-Holocaust moment, the post-colonial moment that we are in now, that have emerged among philosophers and theorists primarily. Okay, so that's what I'm doing in the book as a whole. And on the basis of that understanding, I'll just go into a few of the issues that were raised. First of all, by Flora, the question about one of my arguments is a critique of what I call exceptionalist narratives when it comes to anti-Semitism. That is, arguments that anti-Semitism is unique or wholly different in kind from other forms of racism. And that, of course, raises the question that Flora raised, which is the question about, well, what is specific about Jew hatred? You know, in a way, I've literally just been writing about this. I've just finished another article about 3 French Jewish thinkers and their response to anti-Semitism. One of them is a name that maybe none of you in the room will know. His name's Vladimir Yankelevich, really important moral philosopher, held the chair in moral philosophy at the Sorbonne in the post-war period. And he was, like all of the 3 figures that I look at, a survivor. And Yankelevich really insisted that anti-Semitism is different from other forms of racism. He argued it was different because, number one, Jews are a minority, but they're a minority different from all other minorities over most of the history of Jews, because there was no place where they were the majority. They were only a minority people everywhere once they go into diaspora. Secondly, the form of contempt aimed at Jews is oftentimes not based on the specific bodily differences of Jews. This is one of the things that torments racial thinkers, is trying to sort out what Jewish bodies actually look like and how to place them into a category so they can be labeled and identified and excluded. But Yankelevich is thinking oftentimes about Ashkenazi Jews in the context of Europe, and therefore, unlike blacks, for example, the physical markers of their difference are difficult to ascertain. And so he ends up arguing that what is different about Judeophobia from negrophobia, anti-black racism, or other kinds of racisms is that it is built around what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences. The ways in which identity boundaries are built and created out of fetishizing small differences, which become kind of the perpetual search of what anti-Semites are animated by. There are ways in which we can say that Judeophobia is distinctive, but that doesn't mean it's unique. And what is interesting, what I think is really important in terms of getting both the history right and the politics of anti-racism right, is understanding the ways in which Judeophobia is entangled with these other kinds of phobias, right? That's a significant part of my argument. So we can go back in human history, and if the only thing that we are doing as historians is looking for the ways in which there are the articulation of stereotypes so enduring myths or images of Jews and Judaism, or the ways in which these end up getting internalized by people, prejudice, right? Perhaps in the form of unconscious bias, or that end up getting articulated in law or in social norms in such a way that Jews are excluded or included in certain kinds of spaces, discrimination, or the ways in which Jews are racialized, or the effort to actually exterminate the Jews in the context of the Nazi project of genocide. I've lost a little bit my train of thought. One of the things that we can see is that at every moment within the history of the past, there are ways in which this is getting articulated not just on Jewish bodies. Okay? So the ancient world, before the rise of Christ and Christianity, right? In the ancient world, for example, there are these stereotypes that begin to emerge about Jews, but they are oftentimes worked out in a very similar way to stereotypes about other ethnic groups amongst Greek and Latin-speaking intellectuals. They're entangled in that way, right? If we look at the history of America, for example, one of the things that we've got to try to understand is, and this goes to the analogy with Asian Americans and what constitutes sort of model minorities, is the extraordinary Jewish success in the context of the United States, right? For me, you can't fully understand the Jewish experience in America separate from the history of anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Mexican or anti-Hispanic racism. You can't understand it separate from the history of whiteness. It's entangled in those histories. And if all that you're interested in doing is sort of putting a focus on what the experience of Jews is, you end up having a kind of one-eyed history. And when you have a one-eyed history, you get the history wrong. It's also important to understand this, though, in terms of the current politics of anti-racism, right? If your argument is that there's something completely distinctive, there's something unique about Judeophobia, and that becomes what you say over and over again, why is it that other racialized groups should feel a sense of allyship with your struggle? Okay? So both in terms of getting the history right and getting the politics right, part of my argument is about that entanglement. And I therefore make the claim that actually there's been a lot of emphasis on distinctiveness or uniqueness, and part of what we really need to understand is entanglement. We need more comparative history. We need more entangled histories. Adrian, I'm going to come to your points next, specifically with respect to the hyphen. And I just love that you sort of have wrestled with that a little bit. I do want to say that I'm making a strong argument about the hyphen here, but it's really important to know that actually in other books that I've written, I've made the argument against the hyphen, right? That I have actually shifted my position on this question, and I'm not completely done yet, right? I feel exactly like you do, Adrian. That is like, I think it's really important to hyphenate because the hyphen then becomes a mark of a shared history of racialization that is one that's shared between Arabs and Muslims, and understanding that entanglement, for example, as a scholar of French culture, is absolutely central to understanding what's going on in the context of France today, right, where half of the Jewish community comes from North African, Sephardi, Mizrahi backgrounds in which they are coming out of the Arab world, and in which many of the perpetrators of directly anti-Semitic hate crimes are themselves coming from that same background, right? There's a way in which it's really important to understand that that entangled history. But I don't necessarily want to resolve all of the questions that I want to open, that I want us to reconsider, and the book, if anything, is a plea for scholars who are wading into this territory to do more theorizing. There's too much of a work that's done in our field that lacks that theoretical sophistication that I find to be such a rich, insightful, important part of the history of anti-Black racism, the history of feminism and gender theory, the history of nationalism, the history of colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonial theory, right? So I really appreciated your response more generally, and I'm just going to talk about one question that you raised for me, which is, how do I see myself fitting into the space of critical race theory? And it was clear to me from your comments that you have a clearer understanding of what you mean by critical race theory, probably coming at it from as a legal scholar, which is rigorously where that category, CRT, comes from. That category has itself been so used and diffused that it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint. It's a little bit like the term anti-Semitism. We may need some defamiliarizing there in order to know what we're talking about. But in terms of my own work, I have primarily contributed to what the journal, The Critical Philosophy of Race, calls the critical philosophy of race. So primarily work in dealing with philosophers and the history of philosophy and what they have to contribute to our understandings of race. And that sort of accounts for many of the figures who end up talking about and including. And then I'll just end my comments with some of what Mark raised, a whole series of criticisms. So I guess I just want to say a few things that I wasn't sure were completely clear from the comments that he made. In the last chapter, part of what I do is very explicitly call out and problematize as Judeophobic theorists who have looked at what is going on in the contemporary context. And one of them is Alain Badiou, and I very clearly try to explain the ways in which Badiou is part of what I call a kind of neo-supersessionist tradition, in which his universalism as a philosopher ends up resulting very explicitly in targeting Jews, or at the very least in serving as a masking mechanism for some aspects of what's going on in terms of the targeting of Jews in France today, right? When it comes to Houria Boutelja, she is my example, in particular, of decolonial theory, and part of what I explain I hope, as clearly as I was, rumored to do with other figures, is to say it's totally problematic when she deals with questions of Israel, Palestine, of Jews. That doesn't mean that I think that Alain Badiou should be thrown out as a philosopher. That doesn't mean Houria Boutelja does not offer us a deep, penetrating, and insightful analysis of white supremacy and the ways in which it works in a global framework, the ways in which, in a colorblind France, she insists that actually whiteness is central to French republicanism today, right? I want to be the kind of thinker who can see the insights of someone's position, even when I adamantly disagree with what it is that they articulate. That's also true for me with respect to Judith Butler's anti-Zionism. Judith Butler, in the history of this book, has been the flashpoint, okay? And there's no accident why that is the case. Like, you probably know Judith Butler's name as the leading gender theorist maybe in the world, one of America's most important philosophers, but also the most important person who has taken a stance on behalf of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement when it comes to Israel. And what I do in the section with respect to Butler is sort of talk about some of her own problematic claims, the ways in which she has retracted them. I draw from Butler to try to pull apart criticisms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and why it is really important not to collapse the two, okay? And then I pivot into talking about the ways in which she is a part of a tradition that Hannah Arendt called conscious pariahs. Arendt herself having been accused of, being a self-hating Jew and being anti-Semitic and herself a kind of pariah, even though for me, this is to get Arendt wrong, it's to get Butler wrong. So part of what the book is all about, as Flora so helpfully articulated in introducing it, is like, first of all, nuance, clarity about what it is that you are talking about in a really deep way, right? Learning how not to think about these issues simply in response to the email that has pre-digested everything that you're supposed to think about a person, in response to the Facebook post that has told you exactly what it is that you need to think about, in response to simply slogans and cliches and dogma, because if our level of discourse operates at that level, I don't see any hope for how we move beyond where we are now. So I am interested in articulating concepts and categories and distinctions that can enable us to have a much more mature conversation about Judeophobia and its relationship to Islamophobia and negrophobia and xenophobia and gynophobia, in the interest of things like where our democracy is, and in the interest of values like equality, which is where Adrian sort of framed these things. So I spoke probably too long, and I apologize for that, but we do have some time for Q&A. Ben Wexler, who's a new graduate student here at WashU, who's working on some of these issues, will take the mic around, and if any of you have questions, I'll try and be more brief in my responses.
Thank you, Jonathan, once more for this important and timely contribution that you made. I'd like to return briefly to your choice of the term Judeophobia. And as you pointed out, as it invokes its entanglement with other phobias such as Islamophobia. Jews and Muslims in the context of colonialism have been racialized, and in a more recent context, they have become the object of both fear and fascination. Could you expand this parallel that you see, and how far does it go, and where are the differences? Thank you.
Martin, that is such an impossible question to do on one foot. No, I can't answer that. Like, the only thing that I can do is suggest that we take your classes. Like, that's the only adequate response to that. Part of what I suggest in here is that part of the appreciation of the entanglements between the two is understanding something about the ways in which, with the rise and advent of Islam, there is immediately an alarm, obviously because Islam spreads incredibly quickly and very soon becomes the clear political enemy of Christendom. And so I draw from people like Gil Anajar to make the argument that over the history of the West, from the early rise of Islam forward up until about the 1930s, that Europe, that is Western Christian civilization, identified itself through a two-headed enemy. Islam, Muslims, Turks, Arabs, they came with different names, Saracens, was the external enemy, the political enemy, and Jews were the internal enemy, the theological enemy. All I can do on one foot here tonight is sort of have recourse to Anajar's insight and the ways in which some people have developed it. I know that may also be partly problematic, but I think it's a useful, at least, starting point in response to your question. But I want to sit in on your classes.
Thank you for the talk. I haven't read the book, so if you answered in the book. But it sounds like in the academic circles, the hyphen or no hyphen was the debate, and sort of Judeophobia was a term that at least solved that for the project. But it seems in the political discourse, at least last fall and through now, the debate is between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the entanglement of those two terms, and how do we understand critique of the Jewish state as necessarily or not necessarily anti-Semitic. Does the turn to the word Judeophobia help in that, what I consider more contemporary problem? Or at least more public problem?
Right. That's a really tough question. I don't think that it does completely. except insofar as, so I argue there are 5 main periods, and that these periods are really important because periodization is important for historians. And looking at the social and economic and political and technological forces within a stretch of time can help us to understand something about the really big patterns that are going on. So ancient Judeophobia, different from the rise of Christendom, different from the medieval period, different from the period of modern anti-Semitism. Today, we're dealing with a post-Holocaust, post-colonial context. And part of what makes it a post-colonial context is that Israel emerges as a post-colonial state, like half of the other states that exist within the United Nations. Israel as a state actor also changes very much the terms in which all of this is being debated globally. The fact that you have a state with the major levers of that come with state power enable has resulted in a transformation of things that are going on. But specifically with respect to resolving the tensions and overlaps, the ways in which anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism is oftentimes used as a formula for discounting every form of critique of Israel. I don't think the term Judeophobia necessarily responds to that, but there are a number of moves that I make in the book for trying to explain the ways in which that shortcut is a dead end, just as the shortcut Zionism equals racism is a dead end, and that these are mirror images of one another, and that there are all kinds of ways in which the contemporary debate, when it ends up getting reduced to a set of binaries and kind of fallow slogans, doesn't enable us to understand much about either of these kinds of positions, right? So I do talk about those kinds of issues, but I don't think that the term Judeophobia per se goes all the way to resolving that conceptual difference.
Yes.
I want to know if your expression of Judeophobia includes anger, jealousy, ignorance, because those are palpable things that get reflected in how Jews are perceived, whether today or in the 13th century. And is that part of your theory of how Jews are perceived?
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. Yes, it really does go to the heart of it, because part of what you're pointing at now are what are the underlying feelings that end up animating people responding to the world in the ways in which they do, right? And sometimes people are dismissive of the idea of Judeophobia or Islamophobia or negrophobia or xenophobia because it looks as if it's operating within a lexicon of just kind of psychologizing these issues. But actually, psychology is important in terms of understanding motivations. And so part of the book is an argument that actually hatred is a secondary emotion, and that like anger is a secondary emotion, and that what underlies it is, again, as Flora pointed out, fear or anxiety, or resentment and envy. Like that is the set of underlying emotional motivators that are oftentimes the spark, at least according to the theorists who I pull from, this Freudian, existentialist, Frankfurt School tradition, for helping to explain what's going on. And that means it's not only hatred, because the reverse side of fear is fascination. It's not only castigation, but glorification, right? And the ambivalence of that is a significant animating feature. If it is the case that anti-Semitism per se was as ubiquitous as Mark suggested that it was in his comments, Jews would not have survived. A tiny minority, largely disempowered group through most of human history would not have survived. And it seems to me that part of what we've got to do is explain Jewish survival, and sometimes even flourishing, just as much as we've got to explain persecution and oppression. And so the history of Judeophobia is one built on ambivalence, not eternal hatred, okay? So yes, I am interested in Judeophobia as a category in part because it points to underlying emotions that I think are the main sort of motivating factors, exactly as you suggested.
Hi, my name's Steve Rudinsky. I'm here to learn about anti-Semitism, what is free speech, what is hate speech. I have 3 grandchildren, one at Northwestern, one at Stanford, and one at Columbia. The amount of anti-Semitism that they have experienced this year is unbelievable. It is 10 times worse than anything you've seen in the news or on the radio or in the newspapers. At Northwestern, in class on global health, right in front of my granddaughter and the rest of the class, the professor said, "Kill the Jews." When my grandson at Stanford walks to class, they yell at him, "Kill the Jew." There's banners on every campus, Northwestern, Stanford, and Columbia, that says "From the river to the sea, intifada." Is that free speech or is that hate speech? To me, it's hate speech when someone wants to, when someone wants to say that to me. There is also in the Hamas charter. In the Hamas charter, it reads, and I had it on here. It actually says, "Kill the Jew." If he's hiding behind a tree or a rock, the tree and rock will yell out and say, "Kill the Jew, wipe him out." What is this? Is that free speech to say "from the river to the sea," or is that hate speech?
So you told us this experience September 3rd, right, precisely, at the event that was explicitly about free speech and about hate speech or anti-Semitic speech. And, you know, today I was just reading this really insightful overview that was created by the Nexus Task Force on Anti-Semitism. I encourage you to look it up, Nexus. Like, in part, it comes from what's the nexus between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? That's sort of the central nexus that they're interested in thinking about. And the task force made up of a wonderful group of scholars, and part of what they try to do there is go through and explain in a nuanced way that takes account of intent and impact. All of this discourse that you're talking about is happening on college campuses. And if you go through and look at it, it's actually, they say on the one hand, this could be considered anti-Semitic. On the other hand, context and intent and impact is really significant. They take the phrase "from the river to the sea," for example, which is a phrase that hasn't only been used by Palestinian resistors, right? It's a phrase that has also been used by Israelis to talk about what's going on in Israel. And my response to your question is simply to say, look, obviously there is an enormous amount of anxiety that is running through the Jewish community, and there are lots of ways in which that is completely warranted. These are extraordinarily scary times. But discourse isn't exactly the same thing as anti-Semitic violence, right? I believe that it's not an unfair statement to say that on no college campus anywhere in the United States has any Jewish student actually been grievously harmed in the context of everything that's happened post-October 7th. Bodily harm, right? Physical.
I have a picture of a Jewish boy at Columbia with blood going down his face. I can show my grandson.
No, I know that there have been a...
Going to try to go. That is violent.
Okay, I do hear you, and I know that there are ways in which part of what's happened on college campuses has been extremely scary, has clearly transgressed lines at certain points. I guess all that I'm really doing is kind of making a pitch for some sense of precisely what the Nexus document attempts to do: an understanding of context, an understanding of intent, an understanding of impact, and that sometimes when these things actually end up playing out, they're quite different for the people articulating these positions than there are for the ways in which some students may end up hearing these things, right? I'm sorry if you don't find that a satisfactory answer, but that's where I come down on these issues.
Somebody tells me they want to kill me, that's hate speech. There's no and, if, and and. When someone's yelling at me, kill me,
I totally agree with you.
Do you discount the economic motivation towards anti-Semitism in the history of anti-Semitism?
No, obviously that's been one important element within. I mean, think about, for example, in Eastern Europe, right? That's the clearest example of the ways in which this plays out, where Jews end up taking on social functions, oftentimes as middlemen, and the ways in which that resentment and envy that ends up playing out as hatred comes to work itself out as violence against Jews in the form of pogroms and that kind of thing. No, economic drivers are a very significant factor in the history of Judeophobia.
Would you say it was a major motivating factor?
So, again, the book is about 7 paradigms. And part of the simplest argument of the book is Judeophobia is complicated. It has a really long, winding history that has changed and morphed over time, and we need multiple ways of thinking about it, not just one, right? So economic factors have been, in certain circumstances, a major motivating factor. But we have theories that offer us a whole arsenal of different kinds of motivating factors that have been at work in the history of Judeophobia, right? C2? All right. Thank you so much, all of you, for staying.